From Social Prosperity Partners, this is Community Catalysts. Welcome to Community Catalysts, the podcast that explores the qualities of community leadership and the many paths and forms it can take. I'm your host, Matt Lehrman. Whether you're here for the first time or are a long-time listener, you're part of a community of civic and nonprofit leaders working to build trust, foster collaboration, and strengthen effective governance. Each episode, we aim to offer real-world insights and experiences to help you navigate the challenges of leadership and make a lasting impact in your community. Be sure to follow or subscribe so you never miss an episode. Today, I'm honored to welcome Jim Tedford, President and CEO of the Association for Animal Welfare Advancement, the national organization dedicated to supporting the professionals who run shelters, rescues, and municipal animal services. Jim and his team are all about helping leaders grow, building connections, and shaping policies that recognize the important role animals play in people's lives. Their work isn't just about animal welfare. It's about strengthening communities and making sure the people who care for animals have the training, mentorship, and professional network they need to navigate challenges, share best practices, and lead with confidence. Hey, Jim Tedford, welcome to Community Catalysts.
Matt, it is always a pleasure. And with that introduction, I think I'm going to have you write the copy for our website next time.
There you go. I'm willing to do it. Hey, Jim, before we get too deep into this, I know that you have a sometimes vocal office companion who might chime in during our conversation. Would you mind introducing us to your feathered colleague?
Absolutely. He is a blue and gold macaw who is 36 years old. This year. He was adopted from Lollipop Farm in upstate New York when I was the CEO there. Those many years ago. He came in as an 8-year-old bird as a product of a broken home. His folks split up and neither one of them wanted the bird. So he ended up in my office, and nobody warned me that birds bond with people very quickly. So these many years later, he is still my office mate. And is quiet about half the time, but usually when I get on a podcast or any kind of a Zoom meeting, he decides it's time to chime in.
And does he speak words or just squawk?
He does. He sort of talks. He says what he wants to say when he wants to say it. There's no rhyme or reason to any of it. His favorite thing is to have half of a telephone conversation because he's been in my office for 25 years. He's heard my half of a phone conversation, but he rarely hears the other half. So he likes to mimic me doing my half of a telephone conversation.
I can't wait to hear what he says after this interview. So, Jim, let's talk about the quality of leadership, especially in animal welfare. Many people enter the work of animal welfare to work with animals, only to discover later on that making a real impact means leading people. And whether that's managing a team or cultivating donors or engaging with the community at large. And I think, in your experience, you've dealt with all of that. So first thing I want to ask you, I understand you stepped into the role of executive director at the age of 26?
I was 26 or 27, yeah. Yep.
Did you have to go through that process to realize that leadership in animal welfare was about more than just caring for animals?
I started to learn that lesson on day one in this crazy career of mine. I have literally never done anything but animal welfare related work. So I've been doing this now for 41 years. When I first staggered into my very first animal shelter, I think I was hired only because I was the only person they could find willing to work that cheap. The starting salary was not that exciting. Even at the time, it wasn't that exciting. But I had a degree in animal science, which is really about large animals, food animals. But I figured the animals are animals. So I walked into the animal shelter feeling like I was going to just solve all the world's problems immediately. And I was handed a set of keys, introduced to the staff, and basically told to go forth and lead. So I learned the hard way. It was sort of trial by fire in those early days. And in some ways has been trial by fire ever since. I think it's really interesting in our field in particular. When I started, it really felt like that there was not a great path for learning and training. A lot of it really was just sort of on the job, figure it out, sink or swim kind of leadership. And I'm really pleased that in our field we've come a whole long way from that, and now we have folks who are getting into animal welfare work intentionally and with a plan to grow in their careers and reach places where they lead others. And I'm really pleased that our association is one of the organizations that really helps to facilitate that and make it happen. There are programs in a few schools, universities, and colleges around the country that are preparing people as well. So we've come a long way in 41 years.
I think what I'm hearing you say is there's two tracks here. There are people who come into the world of animal welfare who have learned about animals. They've learned the biology and the behaviors and those kinds of things. And of course, there still needs to be advancement and on-the-job training that comes with it. But I think what you're saying is that from a human leadership perspective, an organizational leadership, a community effectiveness perspective, there is no school training for that. A lot of the people in animal welfare have to learn that on the job. And is that true even today?
I think to some degree it is true even today. I think that there's a lot more learning opportunity available to folks. I think because of technology, with the internet, we launched our learning center about 9 years ago. So we've got a great deal of content available online that really is all about leadership development. And it's something that's accessible to almost anybody in the profession. There is little to no cost associated with accessing that content. So there definitely are some tools that in the toolbox today that did not exist 41 years ago when I started. So I'm really pleased that we're able to bring some of that. But I'll tell you, I think a lot of people were attracted to this work initially because of their love for animals. That's kind of the common denominator, I suppose, of folks in our field. And it's really interesting because loving animals is the easy part. And it's really difficult for folks to understand that when you take a leadership role in an animal welfare or government animal services agency, really your focus is not going to be as much on the day-to-day animal care as much as it's going to be on supervising the people who are providing that care. So it really is all about having an influence over people, both internally and then externally in the community as well, sort of leading other people down that path of discovery and helping them understand what it means to provide quality care and humane treatment for animals. But people are at the core of all of it. There's such diversity in terms of size and sophistication of organizations. And trying to find a level playing field where all those folks can serve a role in moving this mission forward, it can be really tough. We have a tendency, the world tends to look for a scapegoat all the time. So there were always those folks that wanted to sort of blame the shelter for that. The shelter was sort of an easy target and sort of a lightning rod in a community. So those folks who are passionate about the animals, when a shelter was having to make decisions to euthanize animals simply because they had far more than they could ever hope to place, and they didn't want to overcrowd their facilities and which results in its own set of problems. So euthanasia was a population control methodology back in the day. Thankfully it's not nearly used. It's not used nearly to the extent that it was back then. But it was easy to blame the shelter. The shelter was sort of the concentration point where all of these animals came, and then the shelter had to figure out the best possible sort of outcome for each of those animals. And when the outcome wasn't positive, those folks in the community who were passionate and didn't really have any skin in the game, so to speak, would blame the shelter for that. Euthanasia must be the shelter's fault. If they just cared enough, they wouldn't euthanize these animals. And the truth was that animals would have been stacked like cordwood in shelters had they not had that as an option. And nobody thought it was great. Nobody thought it was a good option. I have yet to meet that person in a shelter who thinks euthanasia as a means of population control is a wonderful thing. But it was necessary. It was super necessary back in the day.
Jim, let me jump on that and ask you, what have you learned about the quality of leadership that's necessary in your role as an association executive when there are so many different parties out there whose intentions are noble and pure, but they disagree with each other. What's the leadership that drives agreement or consensus or something through that? How do you get anything done?
It's challenging, but I tell you, diplomacy is sort of the name of the game in leadership and animal welfare. If you don't have the ability to be diplomatic and to work towards sort of common solutions, to find those areas where we're just going to have to agree to disagree in terms of the approach to the work, but to not let that derail you in doing the right thing and continuing to move an organization and a mission forward.
Jim, I want to switch gears on you a little bit because you've had such a long and rich history in animal welfare leadership. I want to ask about a couple of specific incidents in your career, and I want to know what was the experience and what was the learning that you took from it. As we were preparing for today, you mentioned that you once worked in an environment with a dysfunctional board. What you wrote to me was that they put the fun in dysfunctional. And I know that's an experience that a lot of leaders can relate to. You described this to me as having approached it with a failure is not an option mindset, but I gather the experience that you went through made you think differently about that adage. What was the experience? Real briefly, what did you take away from that experience, and how do you think about that now?
Sure. So, I like most leaders in animal welfare and probably leaders in a lot of fields, sort of had that attitude that I could fix anything, that if I just sort of put my mind to it and put some blood, sweat, and tears into it, that I could fix anything. And what I discovered through that experience was that there are some things that simply just don't want to be fixed. And it's important as a leader to acknowledge that as well, and to recognize when it's time just to sort of say, you know what, I'm going to move on to the next thing where I feel like I can really have some impact. This was a board that it had generationally been dysfunctional. They would, when one person rotated off the board, they would make sure that they recruited their next door neighbor or their cousin or somebody who would sort of think the way they did. So it was perpetuated across generations, and there was virtually no changing it. But by George, I was going to fight the fight. I was going to stick it out. I'd been recruited for a couple of other really exciting opportunities and had let them go by because I'm like, I'm not leaving here until we've solved some of these things. And I actually had a consultant come in from what was then called the National Center for Nonprofit Boards. It's called Board Source today, but we had a consultant come in and he was going to walk them through sort of a self-assessment to help them sort of hopefully recognize some of the dysfunction in the way that they operated and interacted with one another and with me, certainly. And he met with the executive committee outside of my presence for about 45 minutes. And he came into my office and he pulled up a chair and he said, if you repeat any of this, I'll deny it, but that is the craziest bunch of people I've ever met. And we had a little conversation that followed, and it dawned on me that they didn't want to be fixed. They were perfectly happy with things the way they were. They weren't really looking for somebody to come in and solve problems. They didn't think the problems were really that serious. They each one of them had their own agenda, their own way of looking at things. So his advice to me was to look for something else, and something else came along right after that, turned into an amazing opportunity. I ended up working for one of the most highly functioning boards I've ever worked with. They helped me raise $5.5 million in a community that didn't know me in no time flat. And we built this state-of-the-art, beautiful new facility, something that it was a pipe dream where I had been. And I would have just ended up languishing and probably driving myself and everybody else a little nuts.
Jim, there's something that resonates deeply for me personally in this story as well, because I founded and ran a nonprofit organization for nearly a dozen years. And when the time for that organization came to an end, I had spent a dozen years, every single day fighting the heroic fight to keep it going. And then finally we reached a point where we had to make a different decision. And my board and I had to have that conversation. And I think it was probably still to this day the hardest challenge I've ever faced in my career. And so when I hear you say this, it reminds me, people who work in nonprofits, people who work in public service, we are so devoted to the mission. We're so devoted to serving our communities in such important ways. It's almost like we are incapable of admitting defeat. And there is a certain bravery to what you say in the ability to say, this isn't working. It's time to stop.
That is absolutely true. And it is probably the hardest decision I ever made, is that recognition in that moment of sort of self-awareness where I'm like, this is not, I can't fix this. I just can't, even I can't fix this. And you're right. We are so completely driven by the mission, and sometimes to our own detriment. I mean, I've watched many leaders across our profession over the years who have fallen sort of prey to boards that were not highly functioning. I think the governance model of a not-for-profit board really needs some exploration. There's got to be a better way to do this. I think, when you find yourself as a leader being supervised by a group of people who by definition know less than you do about what you're doing, and yet they want to weigh in on sometimes on minutia even, it's just not a healthy model for anybody to be following. And now certainly there are boards that are stronger and more effective than others. And I right now I'm working for a board that's made up of people who work for boards, so they all know exactly what that means and how to behave. Yeah, they get it every step of the way. So I'm left to do my work and not micromanaged ever. But I think that's something that really it warrants some exploration. I'd love to see somebody sort of tackle that governance model.
Jim, I understand that you have an experience that while running a large animal welfare group that rescued and sheltered all kinds of animals, not just dogs and cats, that you were part of what I imagine is a pretty significant rescue operation, maybe the largest number of animals rescued in your career. I'm curious, and I know that you were working alongside multiple law enforcement agencies and organizations among multiple states. I'd like to hear that story. I want to know what it took to be part of organizing such a massive effort. What's the leadership lesson that you got from accomplishing something so significant? What did you take from that?
Yeah, I tell you, Matt, that was probably the most humbling experience of my career and maybe my life. It was a massive undertaking on our part. We rescued 321 large animals from a 16-acre piece of property in early December in upstate New York, while the snow was falling and the conditions were less than ideal. And we did it with an literal army of volunteers and law enforcement agencies. We had folks travel from across the country to come and help us. On the day that we actually did the seizure, we had over 100 horse trailers lined up in a row just to pull in and load up animals in need and take them to a place of safety and sanctuary. We had the media there. We had, many law enforcement agents, because we had some of the perpetrators of the cruelty and neglect on this property were present and were armed. So we had folks there to protect us. So it was quite an undertaking. We prepared for about 3 months before we actually did it, because we had to actually build enclosures and build fences. We leased a second farm so that we had enough room to house all of the animals that we knew were going to be coming from this case. The beauty of it was, while we were certainly the lead agency, we had so much help from all over the place. And I think that was the real humbling experience for me. The other piece of that I think is really noteworthy is that in my entire career, I have never, ever gone to a board and asked for their blessing before I went out and did an animal rescue like this one. But we knew that this was going to be very, very costly. And the organization that I worked with there fortunately had really great cash reserves, so we were fine to spend some of that to help. And when I took it to my board and presented the case and said, this is what we want to do and this is what I think it's going to cost us, without any hesitation, there was almost no discussion. My board unanimously said, if we can't spend our money on this, what are we here for? This is what this money was raised for. So we have to do this. We ended up spending very close to $1 million By the time we went through all of the animal care, the rescue work, the litigation expenses, because we went through multiple lawsuits after that. But the happy ending was that almost every one of those animals ended up leaving that facility and being placed in a much, much, much better environment. We housed them in the meantime, but then we managed to place just about every single one of them. And we took 101 horses and ponies in that one day and had about 60 foals that were born over the course of the next few months afterwards, because all the mares, of course, were pregnant because they'd all been running loose with a group of stallions in this little paddock area. So yeah, it was an overwhelming experience. It was a privilege to be able to lead the team through that, and to come out the other side with a really, really successful and happy and positive outcome.
So let's talk about some of the lessons that you learned from this. The number one lesson is it's possible to do really big things and make a difference.
Yes.
What else is on your list?
Yes. So the other thing that's on my list is that no one is an island. And I think if we had gone in as one organization and attempted to tackle this thing on our own, we would have probably fallen flat on our faces. It was just too big and overwhelming. So it was a great illustration for me of the great value of having a strong network in whatever your profession is. In animal welfare, we have a super strong network of folks out there. So we had people I was in upstate New York. We had people from as far away as Houston, Texas. We had a couple of crews from Rhode Island who came over. We had some folks from the ASPCA in New York City who brought a mobile veterinary hospital on site so that we could do some exams on site with some of the animals that we were concerned about. So it was all about that collaboration and networking. It was not looking at ourselves as this one little organization against the world, but we're a whole big profession. And if we band together in situations like that, there's really almost nothing we can't tackle.
It's a wonderful experience. It's a wonderful lesson to remember that it's not just, leadership isn't just communicating with people in our communities, cultivating donors or whatever. It's having a professional network and knowing how and when to pull the strings in that network to accomplish things that you can't do on your own, and to return the favor when called upon.
That's exactly right. I will tell you, Matt, if I had not had the network that I've had over the last 40 years, there's no way in the world that I'd still be sitting here talking to you and still being in this profession. I don't think I would have lasted probably 5 years had I not discovered the network of folks out there. And now, after all these years, there's almost no place I could travel in the country where I wouldn't have a couch to sleep on if I needed it. Because, the camaraderie is amazing. It's just everybody is really in it for the same thing, for the same core mission, and everybody's willing to help everybody else. It's why, we one of our life-saving techniques that's been developed over the last 12 years or so is using transport of animals from places where they're in high supply and low demand to places where the supply is low and the demand is high. So we can move dogs from Texas to New England, where in most shelters, there are very few dogs available for adoption. And the only reason that works is because folks know each other and they network and they trust one another and they communicate with one another on a regular basis. And they really are helping to address needs. One of the great phenomena that has come out of that is that folks on the receiving end of some of these transports are also willing to come back down to the sources of these animals and provide training or deliver supplies or whatever's needed to try and help the shelters at the source cut off the supply. So the ability to collaborate at that level, nationwide and even beyond, is something that it's kept me in the field and kept me sane. And I think a lot of my colleagues would agree with that.
Jim, I want to switch gears and ask you about another area of leadership. The topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Those efforts are under attack, not just at the federal level, but even in state legislatures across the country. Policies that were once seen as essential to building stronger, more representative organizations are now being challenged, restricted, even outlawed. This puts all kinds of civic and nonprofit and community leaders in a pretty tough position. Do they hold firm on their commitment to DEI, even as political and possibly even financial pressures mount? And what are the risks, not just for the organizations, but for the communities they serve if they don't? So I want to ask you a few things. First off, what are you hearing from your members about the pressures that they're encountering about DEI, and how are they dealing with those challenges?
That's a great question. Folks around the country are obviously nervous, with all of the changes coming down the pike, and the changes are happening so quickly that it's almost impossible to even keep track of what's going on out there. So I think people are justifiably nervous about it. As that sort of trend continues, I think organizations their biggest threat is probably going to be from their donors. If donors are not on board with organizations emphasizing diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, and they start to withdraw funding, that's going to be the biggest risk. Most of our members do not work for organizations that are reliant at all on federal funding. So right now, that's not the big concern. The big concern is, how are donors going to respond? Are there going to be donors who will pick up the slack should that become an issue? Should donors start to pull back because of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives?
Let me try that on you a different way, because I did hear recently, and I don't know how far it's progressed, but I heard of a state legislature that is trying to pass a law that prohibits organizations under its domain, which would include cities and towns, from doing business with any company that has a DEI program, which has left some community leaders wondering if, for example, the Ford Motor Company has a DEI program. Does that mean that they can't buy their police cars from Ford?
Yeah, that's the sort of thing that honestly I think is going to keep all of us up at night for a while, because I don't know that anybody's got a really easy answer to any of that. I think if I as an organization have DEI initiatives, there are things that I can do to sort of, even if I just change the description of my work or have to make adjustments to that, I can probably do that and at least get through the next little while. But when you start looking at that level of regulation coming down from the state, that's probably going to affect government agencies far more than it's going to affect not-for-profits. At least in the short term. In the long term, who knows? I mean, nonprofits could be threatened with their nonprofit status being taken away if they want to have diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives. So I think it's such a crazy change in the environment. I don't know that any of us have great answers at this point.
So the Association for Animal Welfare Advancement has had a very robust DEI initiative going on for some time. What does it mean to take a stand for DEI in this moment? I assume it's continuing, but are there adjustments being made?
Yeah, so for us, there are no adjustments being made yet. We are basically doubling down on our intention to make diversity, equity, inclusion a core of what we do. It is basically a core value, so it informs just about every decision we make as an association, and that's the behavior that we really intend to continue modeling for our for all of our members across the spectrum. We'll have to see how things evolve. But right now, we've just completed a new strategic planning cycle, and we've doubled down on our commitment, and intend to hold firm to that.
Jim, let me ask you the same question in reverse. What's at stake for animal welfare, or frankly for any community-driven profession, if it fails to invest in a more inclusive and representative future? What's at stake?
I appreciate you asking the question that way, Matt, because I think that's the way we should be looking at it. What is the cost, and not just the financial cost, but what is the cost to us? So what is the cost to our focus on our missions if we don't pay attention to everybody in the community? I think we as a profession acknowledged, we a number of years ago did a survey to sort of get a baseline for where we stand as a profession on diversity, equity, inclusion. And we were not surprised. We were a little dismayed, but not surprised that we're way behind.
Describe what it means to be way behind. You're not talking about the communities that you serve, you're talking about the people actually working in the profession?
Yes, we have a focus on both of those populations, but we, I believe it starts here. It starts internally. Even our own organization, we hadn't really paid much attention. Our staff and board, we had not paid much attention to whether we had a diverse, equitable, and inclusive board or staff. So we thought we have to start there and model the behavior there, and then start to look at how can we model the behavior out in the profession in a broader sense, and sort of, open our arms a little bit more widely, and make room at the table for folks representing the communities that we serve, because we were not doing that in a very effective way. I mean, the systems that have kept people down, and the sort of systems of racial inequity and a lack of diversity that have been in place nationwide, were certainly impacting animal welfare as well. So we're very consciously trying to sort of open those seats at the table now. We've recognized early on that this is a marathon and not a sprint. It's not going to be something that we can impact in a huge way overnight, but we're not going to stop. We're going to keep working on that.
Jim, final question for you. You mentioned that you've been working in the field of animal welfare for over 40 years. So let me just ask you to take a breath and reflect for a second. Looking ahead, based on the strategic plan that you and your board have been working on, what's your expectation? What's your vision? If we were to fast forward 40 years into the future from now, what will animal welfare look like? What should it look like based on the intentions and the investments of effort that you're making right now?
That's a great question. And I think we're seeing some of it already. I think there are already organizations whose facilities have transitioned. They're no longer sort of intake and outflow facilities for animals, but they're really community centers. It's a place where the community can come and access services or access one another, if that's the case. There's organizations have dog parks, so folks can come from the community and express their love for animals in community with one another. I really believe that we for years have joked that we are one of the few professions that really is working to put itself out of business. And I think, my attitude has shifted significantly in that I don't think we want to put ourselves out of business. I think we want to have a drastically different business model. I think we want to be working with communities, working to preserve the bonds, to provide those needs that communities, that the people and pets in communities have. Whether it's veterinary care, whether it's behavioral support, whether it's food support, whether it's temporary housing, any of those things. I think that's really what we need to be, is a resource for the community beyond just a place where animals are turned in and adopted back out. That model it served us for a time, but we definitely have evolved beyond it and continue to do so. And so, I think in 40 years, there'll probably be more shelters employing social workers than there are kennel techs.
As my mother used to say, from your lips to God's ears. Jim Tedford, thank you so much for the conversation. As always, it's been great visiting with you.
Thanks, Matt. Always a pleasure. Really enjoy talking with you.
Again, thank you to my guest, Jim Tedford, President and CEO of the Association for Animal Welfare Advancement. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review it on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Your feedback helps others discover the show. And don't forget to follow or subscribe so you never miss an episode. This episode was edited by Nick Living the Dream Tantillo. Our executive producer is John Little. I'm Matt Lehrman of Social Prosperity Partners. If you have a question or a comment about today's topic, I'd love to hear from you. Reach me at 602-688-2724 or Matt, M-A-T-T, at socialprosperity.us. Do you have a story of lessons learned on your journey to leadership? Click the podcast guest link in the program notes. I'm always looking for instructive and inspiring voices to feature on the show. Jim Tedford's experience demonstrates that leadership isn't just about serving a cause. It's about strengthening a profession, mentoring future leaders, and driving real change. His decades in animal welfare have improved countless lives and helped transform the field, making it more welcoming, forward-thinking, and community-focused. So here's something to consider. What are you doing to cultivate the next generation of leaders in your community? Thanks for listening. We'll be back soon with another Community Catalyst.